Hi guys, Miss Eglin here. I just wanted to very quickly review chapter 15 of Lois Lowry's The Giver. And in chapter 15, we see Jonas coming into the annex and he immediately notices something is very wrong with the Giver. So he says, I'll come back tomorrow, and the Giver's like, please take some of the pain. So Jonas does his thing. He gets the memory. He is now in what we find out is a war memory, and there's some details here, and in this chapter we have a lot of sensory imagery. So we typically do a chart of like what Jonas sees, smells, hears, feels, and tastes. And if you kind of just even look at this first paragraph here about the memory, he was in a confused, noisy, foul-smelling place. It was daylight, early morning, and the air was thick with smoke that hung yellow and brown above the ground. So that's something that the reader can picture. And around him everywhere, far across the expanse of what seemed to be a field, lay groaning men. A wild-eyed horse, its bridle torn and dangling, trotted frantically through the mounds of men, tossing its head, whinnying in panic. It stumbled finally, then fell and did not rise. So we can see, this is very chaotic, and very, and then Jonas hears this voice say, water. He turns his head, and sadly he sees this kid who is bleeding and wants water. So Jonas, who is now also realizing, he's an injured soldier, in agony, he has, a wound in his arm or something, gives this kid a drink from his canteen, and then the boy sighed, his head fell back, his lower jaw dropping as if he had been surprised by something. A dull blankness slid slowly across his eyes. He was silent. So this boy dies, but the noise continued all around. The cries of the wounded men, the cries begging for water and for mother and for death. Horses lying on the ground shrieked, raised their heads, and stabbed randomly toward the sky with their hooves. And from the distance, Jonas could hear the thud of cannons. Overwhelmed by pain, he lay there in the fearsome stench for hours, listening to the men and animals die, and learned what warfare meant. Finally, when he knew that he could bear it no longer and would welcome death himself, he opened his eyes and was once again on the bed. The Giver looked away as if he could not bear to see what he had done to Jonas. Forgive me, he said. So in this memory, we really get the impression that this is probably the Civil War. And there's just a couple clues that tell us that. The horses, the cannon. He mentions I think a gray uniform. Okay, and in the Civil War, the Confederacy, you might not know, the Confederacy, you had, gray uniforms. The Union had blue. And just from the lack of, planes and tanks and stuff, we kind of assume it's the Civil War, but it doesn't really matter, because what the point of it is that Jonas now is realizing, why the Giver can't function some days. Like, he's in these horrendous memories. And I think the part for me that is really powerful is when he could bear it no longer and would welcome death himself. So, he's in this memory for hours and hours, to the point where he doesn't even want to live anymore. He's in so much pain, and so miserable. And then when he comes to, the Giver almost like hates himself for what he did to Jonas. But again, it was so bad, he really couldn't handle it anymore. So that is the end of chapter 15. I'm going to move on to chapter 16. So after this, Jonas is very traumatized. He doesn't want to go back, but he has to. And, the Giver feels really bad, and he's trying to give him good memories. And Jonas had experienced countless bits of happiness, so he gets a birthday party, he gets a museum, he learns about the, it says the bonds between animals and human by having a horse. And again, we still have a lot of of sensory imagery. He's smelling damp grass, he's drinking cold, clear water. We can really picture these things at campfire. And then, he also has, though he's gotten loneliness, now he knows what solitude is and what's joy. So then he's asking the giver about his favorite memory, and the giver gives it to him. And again, we see these colored lights, a tree which was oddly inside the room. And again, we realize this is a Christmas memory of a family celebrating Christmas. And Jonas, is seeing them unwrap presents, and they're really happy. And then there's a part here where it says, a small child went and sat on the lap of the old woman, and she rocked him and rubbed her cheek against his. And he feels something, this warmth. And then he and the giver, when he comes to talk about grandparents, and then they kind of get into this conversation, parents of the parents, and it's no secret who your grandparents are, but they're in Jonas's community. There's absolutely no relationship with the grandparents. And then he realizes, when I finish my training and become a full adult, I'll have my own dwelling, and Lily will. And then if they have kids, then their parents will live with the other childless adults, and they'll never see or really socialize or have any real contact with their parents again, because it would be too inconvenient. So then Jonas says, our community works pretty well. And then the giver agrees, it works. But then Jonas says, I like the memory. I can see why it's your favorite. I couldn't quite get the word for the whole feeling of it. The feeling that was so strong in the room. Love, the giver told him. Jonas repeated it, love. It was a word and concept new to him. So then he goes into this conversation of, it's not practical, but Jonas really likes it. And he says, I know, the candles are really dangerous, and I can see why we don't have them, but that he likes the light. So that evening, Jonas goes home from training, and he asks his parents, do you love me? There's an awkward silence, and basically they answer him, no. We enjoy you, we're proud of your accomplishments, but it's inappropriate to use love. And then Jonas says, yes, thank you, I do. And that is his first lie to his parents, because they could not understand love because they had never felt it. So we're learning that in the community, with the absence of color, with the absence of feelings because of the pills, with the lack of connection, that people do not feel love for each other. They might be fond, they might kind of, like people a little bit, but they definitely do not feel strong attachments. So then Jonas is, Gabe's still sleeping in his room, and he's kind of talking to Gabe, and then he says things could change, Gabe. Things could be different. We could basically, there could be love. And then this is a really critical part at the end of the chapter. He says Jonas does not take his pill, and something within him, something that had grown there through the memories, told him to throw the pill away. So now we kind of know Jonas is not going to be taking his pill, and his feelings are going to come back. In chapter 17, there is an undeclared holiday, so Jonas doesn't have to go to school. It's a month later, and his stirrings had returned. He feels a little guilty, but again, he likes feeling things, so he can't go back to not feeling things. He could see all the colors. And so seeing the colors, you know, he's getting more of an experience. And, you know, he's feeling happy, but he's realizing that no one else really has strong feelings. And he's thinking back to, you know, that sharing of feelings that we saw in the first few chapters, and he's realizing his family did not really feel. So he and the giver are the only people really feeling things. So he comes across a group of children playing a game, and we come to find out it's a game of war. And Asher's running the game as the, you know, assistant director of recreation, or the director of recreation and training. And, you know, he said it's a harmless pastime that used up their contained energy and ended only when they all lay posed in freakish postures on the ground. So the kids play this game. Now, of course, they don't know that it's based on real war. So Jonas kind of is watching this game, and in his mind, Jonas saw again the boy who had lain dying on a field and had begged him for water. He had a sudden choking feeling as if it were difficult to breathe. So at this point, it's almost like, you know, Jonas starts having a panic attack. He's trying not to cry, but basically, you know, he just kind of like freezes and stands there, and the kids are all like looking around like, what's happening? And they basically, he just breaks up the game, and Asher says to him, you ruined the game. And then Jonas says to Asher, his friend, he says, don't play it anymore. And then Asher gets a little bit flustered and said, I'm the one who's training for assistant recreation director. Games aren't your area of expertness. And again, we know that Asher mispronounces words. And Jonas corrected him automatically by saying expertise. And he says, whatever, you can't say what we play, even if you are going to be the new receiver. Now, and then Asher looks at him and realized he may have gone too far. Because remember, you know, Jonas is going to be the new receiver of memory. And then he says, I apologize for not paying you the respect you deserve. And then Jonas tries to explain it's a cruel game, but Asher can't understand it. So Fiona comes along and basically is like, let's go for a ride along the river. And then Jonas looks at her, and, you know, he does like her. And he said, but such times had been taken from him now. He can't relate to these people anymore. You know, he feels things for them and loves them. They cannot feel anything for him back. So again, that night at home, you know, he's talking with his family, and, you know, he said it was another depressing day. We now find out it's almost the next December. So it's been a year since the ceremony of 12. So they're talking, and then we find out that the father is going to have to do this ceremony of release because twins are going to be born tomorrow. And, you know, the smaller one gets released, and they talk about it. And, you know, Jonas says somebody else comes to get him, somebody from elsewhere. And then the dad says, that's right, Jonas Bonus. And then Lily goes on this, you know, kind of not rant really, but just starts blurting out this story about like how confusing it would be if there were twins everywhere. And then the mother kind of says to her, you know, you should be a storyteller. And then she keeps going on and on. They go, Lily, it's bedtime. So that's the end of 17, where we really see Jonas not being able to relate to people and having a really hard time, as the giver said. And like his mother said, he is now separate from his friends. And he doesn't really have other people in his training who can relate to what he's going through. So he really only has the giver and Gabe, because Gabe, now that he gets the memories, is really the only other person who is, you know, going to have feelings and memories, you know, like he does. Okay, so Again, that's where we are at the end of 17. And again, email me, leave me a comment if you have any questions. But that is basically the gist of those chapters. Thanks for listening. Happy reading.